When you hear the title The Birth of Tragedy, you might assume Friedrich Nietzsche is simply explaining where Greek tragedy came from. That is not what this book is really about. Nietzsche is using Greek tragedy to ask a much bigger question. How should you live when existence itself contains suffering, chaos, conflict, loss, and death? And once you understand that question, the whole book starts to make more sense. Because Nietzsche is not primarily interested in ancient Greek theater. He is interested in the Greeks because he thinks they discovered something about life that modern people have forgotten. You usually think of the ancient Greeks as people who loved beauty, order, reason, harmony, balance, and perfect human forms. And Nietzsche agrees that this image exists, but he thinks it is incomplete. He wants you to look at something underneath the beautiful statues, philosophy, poetry, temples, and myths. He wants you to look at the fact that Greek culture was surrounded by suffering. Life was short. Disease was everywhere. War was common. Death was unavoidable. The gods were not necessarily moral beings who protected innocent people. Nature was powerful and indifferent. Human beings had very little control over what happened to them. So Nietzsche asks you to consider something strange. Why did a culture that understood suffering so well create such an extraordinary culture of beauty? Why didn't the Greeks simply become pessimistic? Why didn't they conclude that life was meaningless and therefore not worth living? Why did they create gods, myths, music, poetry, festivals, theater, sculpture, and tragedy? Nietzsche's answer is that they did not solve the problem of suffering by pretending suffering didn't exist. Instead, they learned how to transform it. And for Nietzsche, that ability is one of the deepest expressions of human creativity. This is where two concepts become central to the entire book: the Apollonian and the Dionysian. If you understand these two concepts, you understand the basic framework of the birth of tragedy asterisk. But don't make the mistake of thinking that Apollo simply means good and Dionysus simply means bad, or that one represents reason while the other represents irrationality. Nietzsche's argument is more complicated than that. Apollo and Dionysus represent two fundamentally different ways of experiencing existence. Apollo represents form, boundaries, individuality, clarity, proportion, appearance, dreams, images, and order. Dionysus represents intoxication, music, instinct, unity, transformation, excess, suffering, ecstasy, and the dissolution of individual boundaries. You can think of Apollo as the impulse that gives shape to life. Dionysus is the impulse that takes you beyond the individual shape. And Nietzsche's central claim is that Greek tragedy became great because these two forces were brought together. You need both. And once you understand why Nietzsche thinks you need both, you can understand his criticism of modern culture, his criticism of Socrates, his view of art, his interpretation of tragedy, and even his later philosophy. So let's start with Apollo. Apollo, the need for form. Apollo is the Greek god of many things, including prophecy, music, poetry, and artistic order. But Nietzsche is particularly interested in Apollo as a symbol of individuation and form asterisk. To understand this, you first need to understand what Nietzsche means by the individual. You normally experience yourself as a separate person. You have your own body, your own name, your own memories, your own ambitions, your own fears, your own relationships. You look at the world and see yourself as one person surrounded by other people and objects. This sense of being a distinct individual is so basic that you rarely question it. Nietzsche thinks art plays an important role in creating and maintaining this experience. A painting has boundaries. A sculpture has a particular form. A story has characters. A myth gives you identifiable gods and heroes. A person has an identity. A world of clear forms makes existence easier to understand. And this is where the Apollonian impulse becomes important. When life is chaotic, you create form. When reality is overwhelming, you create images. When existence is confusing, you create stories. When suffering is difficult to understand, you create meaning. This doesn't necessarily mean that the meaning is objectively present in the universe. It means that human beings have a tendency to give shape to what would otherwise be difficult to experience. You can see this everywhere. You organize your life into categories. You give names to things. You create routines. You establish boundaries. You develop an identity. You create stories about your past. You imagine a future. You decide what matters and what doesn't. You turn an enormous and complicated world into something you can actually navigate. That is an Apollonian activity. And Nietzsche does not think this is a weakness. He thinks it is necessary. Without some degree of form, you would be overwhelmed by existence. Imagine waking up and experiencing every sensation, every possibility, every uncertainty, every fear, every memory, and every potential future at the same time. You would not experience that as freedom. You would experience it as chaos. Your mind needs structure. Your culture needs structure. Your art needs structure. Your identity needs structure. So Apollo represents this human need to create boundaries and forms. But there is a problem. The forms you create are not the whole of reality. They are interpretations. Your identity is not the entirety of your existence. Your categories do not contain everything. Your explanations are never complete. And this is where Dionysius enters. Dionysius, what exists beneath the individual. Dionysius represents something almost opposite. If Apollo gives you boundaries, Dionysius dissolves them. If Apollo emphasizes individuality, Dionysius emphasizes unity. If Apollo gives you a stable image of yourself, Dionysius disrupts that image. If Apollo gives you beautiful forms, Dionysius reminds you that behind those forms there is something much more chaotic. Nietzsche associates Dionysian experience with music, intoxication, dancing, ecstatic states, crowds, instinct, sexuality, suffering, and the loss of ordinary individual boundaries. But you shouldn't interpret this simply as Nietzsche telling you to get drunk and lose control. That would completely miss the philosophical point. Dionysus represents an experience in which the rigid boundaries between you and the world become less important. Normally you think, I am here. The world is over there. I am an individual. Other people are separate individuals. My identity is stable. My desires belong to me. My suffering belongs to me. Dionysian experience challenges that structure. You become aware that you are part of something much larger than your individual identity. Your body connects you to nature. Your emotions connect you to other human beings. Your existence depends on countless things outside your control. You are born. You grow. You suffer. You desire. You reproduce. You age. You die. And no matter how sophisticated your individual identity becomes, you remain part of this larger process. This is one reason Nietzsche connects Dionysus with tragedy. Tragedy reminds you that your individual story is not the entire story. The hero may struggle. The hero may make decisions. The hero may fight. The hero may have ambitions, but eventually the hero can be destroyed. And yet the tragic experience doesn't necessarily tell you. Life is therefore worthless. Instead, Nietzsche thinks great tragedy can produce the opposite reaction. It can make you say, yes, existence contains suffering, and I still affirm it. That is much more important. The problem of suffering. Now you reach the central issue. Why do you suffer? And what should you do about it? There are many possible answers. You could try to eliminate suffering. You could try to distract yourself from it. You could pretend it doesn't exist. You could develop a philosophy that tells you suffering is an illusion. You could believe that suffering has a higher purpose. You could conclude that life itself is a mistake. Nietzsche is interested in a different possibility. What if you don't need to eliminate suffering in order to affirm life? What if suffering is not an argument against existence? This is one of the deepest ideas behind the birth of tragedy asterisk. Nietzsche is challenging the assumption that a good life must be a life without suffering. You might unconsciously believe this. You might think, if life were really good, I wouldn't have to suffer this much. If I can eliminate enough problems, then I will finally be able to enjoy existence. The ideal life is one in which everything is safe, predictable, comfortable, and controlled. Nietzsche doesn't accept that picture. He thinks suffering is inseparable from existence. You cannot completely remove uncertainty. You cannot eliminate death. You cannot guarantee that people will love you. You cannot guarantee that your plans will succeed. You cannot control everything that happens to your body. You cannot prevent every loss. You cannot permanently protect yourself from disappointment. And if you make the absence of suffering your definition of a good life, you have created a standard that reality will never satisfy. So Nietzsche asks you to consider another approach. Instead of asking, how can I create a life without suffering? Ask, how can I become capable of affirming life even though suffering exists? That is a very different philosophy. You are no longer trying to escape existence. You are trying to become strong enough to face it. And this is where tragedy becomes philosophically important. Why would anyone enjoy tragedy? Think about what tragedy actually gives you. You watch a character suffer. A character loses someone. A character makes a terrible decision. A character discovers something horrifying. A character's ambitions collapse. A character dies. And yet people voluntarily go to watch tragedies. Why? If suffering is automatically bad, then tragedy should be unpleasant in the simplest possible sense. But great tragedy can be deeply satisfying. You can leave a tragic story feeling devastated and strangely energized at the same time. Nietzsche wants you to take that seriously. Why would human beings find value in representations of suffering? His answer is that tragedy can transform suffering into art. And that changes your relationship with suffering. You are not simply being shown pain. You are experiencing pain through form, music, rhythm, language, character, symbolism, and performance. The suffering becomes something you can contemplate, something you can experience without being completely destroyed by it. This is one of the great powers of art. Art doesn't necessarily solve your problems. It changes the way you experience them. You might not be able to remove grief, but you can turn grief into a song. You might not be able to change the fact that life is temporary, but you can turn that awareness into poetry. You might not be able to control chaos, but you can create something beautiful from it. And Nietzsche thinks this capacity is fundamental. You don't always defeat suffering by destroying it. Sometimes you defeat it by transforming it. The Greek question. This is where Nietzsche's interpretation of ancient Greece becomes controversial. He thinks the Greeks were not naive optimists. They knew that existence was frightening. They knew about suffering. They knew about death. They knew about violence. They knew that the gods themselves could be cruel. So why did Greek culture produce such an intense celebration of beauty? Nietzsche's answer is that beauty was partly a response to the horror of existence. The Greeks didn't create beautiful gods because life was already perfectly beautiful. They created beautiful gods because beauty helped make life bearable. This is a crucial distinction. You might think, the Greeks were happy, therefore they created beautiful art. Nietzsche is suggesting something closer to. The Greeks confronted the terrible side of existence, and therefore they needed powerful forms of beauty. That completely changes how you interpret Greek culture. Apollo becomes more important. Beauty becomes more important. Myth becomes more important. And tragedy becomes the point where beauty and suffering meet. Greek tragedy was not just sad entertainment. Nietzsche believes that Greek tragedy reached its highest form when the Apollonian and Dionysian forces worked together. You have the individual character. That is Apollonian. You have the visible world of images, dialogue, costumes, action, and narrative. That is Apollonian. But underneath it, you have music. You have the chorus. You have collective emotion. You have a sense that the individual is connected to something much larger. That is Dionysian. The tragedy, therefore, gives you both experiences at once. You see an individual hero, but through the music and chorus, you experience something larger than the individual. You see a particular story, but you also encounter universal suffering. You see one person's destruction, but you recognize something about existence itself. That combination is what makes tragedy powerful. And Nietzsche believes that when tragedy is working properly, you don't simply walk away thinking, that character had a terrible life. You experience something deeper. You recognize that suffering is part of existence. And instead of concluding, therefore existence is worthless, you can arrive at, existence contains all of this, and it is still worth affirming. That is the tragic attitude. The tragic attitude. The word tragic usually means something sad or catastrophic. Nietzsche means something much more philosophical. A tragic person is not simply someone who suffers. A tragic worldview is one that recognizes suffering without allowing suffering to become the final argument against life. This distinction is essential. You can be pessimistic because you think suffering proves life is bad. Or you can be tragic because you recognize suffering and still say yes to life. Nietzsche is much more interested in the second position. Imagine that you are told that your life will contain failure. You will lose things. You will experience rejection. You will make mistakes. People you care about will eventually change or leave. Your body will age. Your plans will sometimes fail. You will not control everything. At some point, you will die. There are two broad ways you could respond. You could say, if these things are unavoidable, then life is not worth living. Or you could say, these things are part of life, so I will not make my acceptance of life conditional on their disappearance. The second position is closer to Nietzsche's tragic affirmation. And you can see why this becomes important later in his philosophy. Nietzsche eventually develops the idea of affirming existence so strongly that you would be willing to accept your life as a whole. But the early version of that idea is already visible here. The question isn't, can you find a version of existence without suffering? The question is, can you affirm existence as it actually is? Why Nietzsche distrusts simple optimism. This also explains why Nietzsche is suspicious of easy optimism. Optimism often tells you that everything will work out. Nietzsche doesn't believe you should need that promise. If your philosophy only works when everything goes well, then your philosophy is fragile. What happens when something terrible happens? What happens when your plans collapse? What happens when you lose someone? What happens when you discover that you were wrong? What happens when life refuses to give you the ending you wanted? If your worldview depends on everything having a happy explanation, it can collapse very quickly. Nietzsche wants something stronger. He wants a philosophy that can survive contact with suffering. That is one reason tragedy is so important. Tragedy doesn't promise that everything will work out. It doesn't guarantee justice. It doesn't guarantee that the good person will win. It doesn't guarantee that suffering will be explained. It shows you suffering directly. And somehow, through art, it can still make existence feel worth affirming. That is much more demanding than optimism. Optimism says, everything will be okay. Tragic affirmation says, even if everything isn't okay, I can still affirm life. That is a much stronger position. Apollo and Dionysius are not enemies. You might be tempted to choose one. Maybe you think Apollo sounds civilized and Dionysius sounds chaotic. So perhaps you should choose Apollo. But Nietzsche doesn't want that. He believes the greatness of Greek tragedy comes from their interaction. You need Apollo because without form, everything becomes unintelligible. You need Dionysus because without access to something deeper than your individual identity, form can become superficial. You need individuality. But you also need to recognize that you are part of something larger. You need reason. But you cannot reduce existence to reason. You need order, but you cannot eliminate chaos. You need boundaries, but you cannot pretend that your boundaries are absolute. You need appearance, but you should remember that appearance is not the whole of reality. You need dreams, but you should also confront reality. This tension is not a problem Nietzsche wants to solve completely. It is part of the human condition. And that is a major theme throughout his philosophy. He does not always want you to eliminate contradictions. Sometimes he wants you to become strong enough to live with them. The individual is not the whole truth. The Apollonian world gives you the individual. You are you. I am me. This person is separate from that person. This identity is different from that identity. That is necessary for ordinary life. But Nietzsche thinks there is another level underneath it. Dionysian experience reminds you that individuality is not as absolute as it feels. You depend on nature. You depend on other people. Your body is made from processes you didn't design. Your language came from a culture you didn't create. Your beliefs were influenced by people you never met. Your personality was shaped by experiences you didn't completely control. Even your sense of self depends on countless external factors. So when you say, I am completely independent, Nietzsche would ask you to look more closely. Independent of what? Your body, your culture, your language, your environment, your history, Your relationships. You may be an individual, but you are not an isolated substance floating independently from everything else. You are part of a larger process. The Dionysian experience makes that more visible. And that can be frightening, because your individual identity gives you a sense of control. If you believe you are completely separate, you can imagine that you are the author of your existence. But if you recognize how deeply connected you are to forces outside your control, that illusion becomes weaker. And Nietzsche thinks this can be both terrifying and liberating. The fear of losing yourself. You might ask, if the Dionysian experience dissolves individuality, why would that be desirable? Because your individual identity can also become a prison. You create a picture of who you are. You decide, this is what I am. This is what I believe. This is what I do. This is what people like me do. This is the kind of person I am. And then you spend years defending that identity. You become afraid of changing because changing would threaten the story you have created about yourself. You become afraid of admitting that you were wrong. You become afraid of trying something unfamiliar. You become afraid of failure because failure would contradict the image you have created. The Dionysian experience disrupts that rigidity. It reminds you that you are capable of becoming something different. You are not a finished object. You are a process. And that idea becomes increasingly important in Nietzsche's later philosophy. But even here, you can see the beginning of it. Music has a special role. Nietzsche gives music an unusually important position. Why? Because music does not represent the world in exactly the same way that ordinary language does. If you describe a tree, you use concepts. If you tell a story, you use characters and events. If you write a philosophical argument, you use propositions. Music works differently. Music can affect you directly without needing to tell you a literal story. A piece of music can make you feel tension, release, excitement, sadness, energy, longing, peace. And it can do this without giving you a precise proposition about what you should believe. For Nietzsche, this makes music particularly important for Dionysian experience. Music can reach beneath your ordinary conceptual identity. You don't need to translate every sound into an argument. You experience it. This matters because Nietzsche thinks conceptual thought has limits. You cannot capture all of existence through definitions. You cannot reduce every human experience to a sentence. You cannot completely explain suffering by giving it a name. Sometimes experience comes before explanation. Music represents that dimension particularly well. This is one reason Nietzsche's early philosophy is so closely connected to art. He is asking whether art can reveal something that ordinary rational explanation cannot. Why tragedy needs the chorus. The Greek chorus is especially important to Nietzsche. Modern audiences might think of the chorus as background commentary. Nietzsche sees something much deeper. The chorus creates a collective perspective. Instead of experiencing the story only through one individual's point of view, you experience something more communal. The chorus can respond to what happens. It can express fear, hope, suffering, celebration. It creates an atmosphere that is larger than any individual character. And that helps produce the Dionysian dimension of tragedy. The hero is an individual, but the chorus reminds you that the hero exists within a larger human and natural reality. The individual story becomes connected to something collective. This is part of why Nietzsche thinks early Greek tragedy was so powerful. It didn't simply put an individual character on stage and ask you to identify with that person. It created a tension between individuality and collective experience. Apollo and Dionysus were both present. The tragic hero. Now think about the hero. You usually expect a hero to win. The hero has a goal. The hero faces obstacles. The hero overcomes them. The story ends with success. Nietzsche's tragic hero is different. The hero may fail. The hero may suffer. The hero may die. And the story can still be great. Why? Because the purpose of tragedy is not necessarily to show you how an individual can control everything. It can show you the limits of individual control. You can be intelligent. You can be brave. You can make decisions. You can fight and still lose. That is not necessarily a failure of the story. It is part of what makes the story tragic. You are forced to confront a fact that modern culture often tries to avoid. You are not completely in control. You can influence your life. You can make choices, but you cannot control everything. And no amount of personal ambition can eliminate that fact. Tragedy makes you confront this without offering a comforting solution. The death of the hero doesn't mean the death of life. This is where Nietzsche's interpretation becomes interesting. If the hero dies, why can the audience leave the theater feeling energized? Why isn't the conclusion simply depressing? Because the meaning of tragedy isn't limited to the individual character. The individual is destroyed, but the larger process of life continues. Nature continues. Human beings continue. The culture continues. New generations appear. The music continues. The story becomes part of a larger tradition. The individual disappears, but existence does not. This is one reason Dionysus is connected to destruction and renewal. Things die. Things change. Things are transformed. And life continues through that transformation. You can therefore interpret tragedy as teaching you something about mortality. You are temporary, but that does not automatically make your existence meaningless. In fact, your temporary existence may be part of what gives it intensity. If you knew you would live forever, individual moments might have a completely different value. The fact that your time is limited changes how you experience it. Nietzsche does not simply want you to solve death. He wants you to think about whether mortality necessarily makes life negative. Nietzsche's criticism of Socrates. Now you reach one of the most controversial parts of the book. Nietzsche attacks Socrates, but you need to understand why. He isn't simply saying, Socrates was stupid. That would be absurd. Nietzsche clearly recognizes the enormous intellectual power of Socratic thought. His criticism is directed at something deeper. He believes Socrates represents a major change in Western culture, a shift toward the belief that reason can solve existence. Socrates asks questions. He demands definitions. He challenges assumptions. He uses argument. He believes that knowledge and rational understanding have enormous power. And Nietzsche thinks this attitude eventually becomes destructive when it is turned into a complete worldview. The problem begins when you assume. If something can be understood rationally, it can therefore be controlled or solved rationally. Nietzsche doesn't believe that. There are aspects of existence that cannot be resolved through reasoning alone. You can understand why people suffer. That doesn't eliminate suffering. You can understand death. That doesn't make death disappear. You can explain desire. That doesn't remove desire. You can analyze tragedy. That doesn't replace experiencing tragedy. You can define beauty. That doesn't create beauty. So Nietzsche worries about a culture that begins believing that rational knowledge can eventually solve all human problems. He sees this as a kind of intellectual optimism. And he believes that Greek tragedy began to decline as this attitude became more dominant. Socratic optimism. Nietzsche's criticism of Socrates can be understood through the idea of Socratic optimism The basic attitude is something like this. If you understand something correctly, you can solve it. If you know what is good, you will do what is good. If you understand the world, you can improve it. If you identify the cause of a problem, you can fix it. Knowledge becomes the path to salvation. Nietzsche thinks this attitude has enormous consequences. Because once you believe that reason can solve everything, tragic art starts to look unnecessary. Why spend time confronting the mystery of existence through music and myth? Why accept uncertainty? Why accept contradictions? Why accept suffering as something that cannot simply be eliminated? Instead, you analyze. You explain. You categorize. You argue. You try to solve. Nietzsche thinks Western civilization eventually becomes increasingly dominated by this tendency. And he doesn't believe that this is automatically progress. He thinks something may have been lost. The problem with always needing an explanation. Think about your own life. When something bad happens, you usually want an explanation. Why did this happen? Who caused it? What can I do? How can I prevent it from happening again? This is often useful. But what happens when you encounter something that has no satisfying explanation? Someone dies. A relationship ends. You fail despite doing everything you could. Someone you trusted betrays you. A disaster happens to people who did nothing to deserve it. You might desperately search for a reason. Sometimes there isn't one that satisfies you. Nietzsche's tragic worldview asks you to become capable of facing that. You don't always need existence to give you a neat explanation before you can affirm it. That is difficult, because your mind wants closure. Your mind wants causes. Your mind wants justice. Your mind wants the universe to make sense. Nietzsche is asking you to consider that reality may not owe you that kind of explanation. And rather than becoming nihilistic because of that, he wants you to develop a stronger relationship with existence. Why Nietzsche thinks art can be more important than philosophy. This is one of the most radical ideas in the book. You normally assume philosophy is the highest form of understanding. You think philosophers search for truth. Artists create representations. So philosophy should be more intellectually serious. Nietzsche challenges that hierarchy. He suggests that art may sometimes reveal something about existence that conceptual philosophy cannot. Why? Because art doesn't necessarily require you to reduce experience to concepts. A tragedy can show you suffering without giving you a philosophical formula explaining why suffering exists. Music can communicate emotional realities that cannot be translated perfectly into propositions. A myth can express something about human existence without being a scientific explanation. Art can therefore allow you to experience contradictions instead of forcing you to eliminate them. This is especially important for Nietzsche because he thinks existence itself is full of contradictions. Life contains birth and death, pleasure and pain, creation and destruction, beauty and horror, individuality and unity, order and chaos. If your philosophy insists that everything must fit into a clean logical system, you may have to simplify reality to make the system work. Art can sometimes preserve the complexity. That is why Nietzsche takes art so seriously. The meaning of myths. Myth also becomes extremely important. You might think myth is simply an old story that people believed before science existed. Nietzsche sees more value in it. A culture needs stories that help people interpret existence. Myths can provide images through which people understand suffering, death, desire, nature, conflict, and human behavior. A myth doesn't need to be scientifically true to have psychological or cultural power. Think about the stories you use to understand your own life. You may tell yourself, "This happened because I became stronger." Or, "That failure taught me something." Or, "That experience changed who I am." These are interpretations. Your life consists of events, but you organize those events into a narrative. Culture does something similar on a much larger scale. Myths give societies shared narratives. They tell people what courage means, what betrayal means, what suffering means, what death means, what greatness means, what the relationship between humans and nature means. Nietzsche thinks Greek myth provided a powerful cultural framework for confronting existence. And when that framework weakened, something changed. Why Nietzsche thinks the Greeks needed their gods. You might assume that people create gods because they don't understand natural events. Nietzsche's interpretation is more psychological. The Greek gods give form to human existence. They make abstract forces visible. Apollo represents order and beauty. Dionysius represents ecstatic transformation and the breakdown of boundaries. Other gods embody desire, war, wisdom, love, conflict, and other dimensions of existence. This allows human beings to encounter difficult aspects of life through images and stories. Instead of thinking about abstract chaos, you can imagine Dionysus. Instead of thinking about ideal form, you can imagine Apollo. The myth gives the experience a shape. Again, this is the Apollonian function. You give form to something that would otherwise be overwhelming. Beauty as a defense against meaninglessness. This is one of Nietzsche's most important insights. Beauty isn't merely decoration. Beauty can make existence bearable. Imagine a world in which you know that everything eventually disappears. Every person dies. Every building eventually disappears. Every generation is replaced. Every achievement becomes history. Nothing remains exactly as it was. You could interpret that as an argument for meaninglessness. Or you could respond differently. You could say, "Precisely because things are temporary, I will create something beautiful." That is much closer to Nietzsche. Art doesn't defeat mortality by making things permanent. It responds to mortality by creating value within temporary existence. A song ends. A painting ages. A performance disappears. A human life ends. But the fact that something is temporary doesn't automatically make it worthless. This is an important shift. You don't need permanence in order to have value. You don't need eternal guarantees in order to affirm something. The question Nietzsche is really asking. At this point, you can see that the birth of tragedy asterisk is not really asking. How did Greek tragedy develop? The deeper question is, what kind of culture is capable of saying yes to life? And Nietzsche thinks the answer involves art. A healthy culture doesn't need to deny suffering. It doesn't need to pretend everything has a rational explanation. It doesn't need to promise that everything will eventually become comfortable. Instead, it develops powerful ways of transforming suffering into meaning, beauty, creativity, and affirmation. Greek tragedy is Nietzsche's example. The tragic worldview says, life is difficult. Life is temporary. Life contains suffering. Human beings are limited. Death cannot be avoided. And yet life can still be affirmed. That is the basic philosophical achievement Nietzsche sees in tragedy. Pessimism versus tragic affirmation. You need to distinguish two things. Pessimism says, life contains suffering, therefore life is bad. Tragic affirmation says, life contains suffering, and I still affirm life. Those statements may sound similar at first. They aren't. The first makes suffering a reason to reject existence. The second refuses to make your acceptance of life conditional on the absence of suffering. This becomes one of Nietzsche's lifelong concerns. He doesn't want a philosophy that only works under ideal conditions. He wants a philosophy strong enough to confront the worst parts of existence. You can think of it as a stress test. If your worldview collapses the moment something terrible happens, how strong was it? If your values depend on everything going according to plan, what happens when the plan fails? If your belief in life depends on life being comfortable, what happens when comfort disappears? Nietzsche wants a deeper affirmation. Why suffering can become creative. This does not mean suffering is automatically good. That distinction matters. Nietzsche is not saying, go suffer because suffering makes you better. That would be a simplistic interpretation. His point is that suffering can become material for creation. You can suffer and become bitter. You can suffer and become destructive. You can suffer and become hopeless. But you can also transform suffering. You can turn it into art, into understanding, into strength, into compassion, into ambition, into a new way of seeing yourself. The suffering itself isn't necessarily valuable. Your ability to transform your relationship with it can be. This is why Nietzsche cares so much about artistic transformation. The artist takes something difficult and gives it form. The tragic poet takes suffering and creates a work that can be experienced by thousands of people. The audience encounters suffering, but also encounters beauty. That transformation is central to Nietzsche's understanding of art. The danger of escaping reality. You can now understand why Nietzsche criticizes certain forms of culture. If you constantly need to escape reality, you may eventually become unable to affirm reality. You might escape through fantasies. You might escape through ideology. You might escape through excessive comfort. You might escape through abstract theories. You might escape through entertainment. You might escape through religion. You might even escape through philosophy. Anything can become an escape if you use it to avoid confronting existence. Nietzsche wants something different. He wants you to use culture to become more capable of confronting life. That is why art matters. Great art doesn't necessarily make reality disappear. It can make you more capable of looking at reality. Tragedy doesn't remove death. It makes you capable of experiencing mortality without immediately concluding that life is worthless. That is a major difference. The Dionysian does not mean do whatever you want. This is worth emphasizing because Nietzsche is often misunderstood. Dionysus is not simply an excuse for impulsive behavior. The Dionysian is not. Stop thinking and do whatever feels good. That interpretation is far too shallow. The Dionysian concerns the experience of existence beyond rigid individual boundaries. It concerns instinct, transformation, ecstasy, music, collective experience, the dissolution of fixed identity, the recognition that life is larger and more chaotic than the individual ego. You can therefore experience something Dionysian through art without behaving recklessly. A piece of music can produce a sense of emotional intensity. A concert can create a feeling of collective experience. A powerful tragedy can make you forget your ordinary concerns. A dance can change your awareness of your body. These experiences challenge the ordinary boundaries of the self. That is the philosophical point. The Apollonian does not mean be rational. The same clarification applies to Apollo. Apollo is not simply reason. He represents a broader set of qualities: form, clarity, beauty, measure, individuality, dream imagery, appearance, structure. Reason can be part of this, but Apollo is much broader. You can understand the Apollonian as the human need to make existence intelligible and beautiful through form. A sculpture is Apollonian. A clear image is Apollonian. A beautiful myth is Apollonian. A defined character is Apollonian. A stable identity is Apollonian. The important thing is that Apollo gives shape to what would otherwise be overwhelming. The two forces within you. Now bring these ideas into your own life. You probably have an Apollonian side. You want structure. You want a plan. You want to know what you are doing. You want an identity. You want boundaries. You want predictable routines. You want to understand things. You want your life to make sense. But you also have a Dionysian side. You sometimes want to forget your plans. You want music. You want intense experiences. You want connection. You want to lose yourself in something. You want spontaneity. You want experiences that cannot be reduced to a schedule. And these aren't necessarily contradictions that need to be eliminated. You need structure to function. But if you become completely rigid, life becomes mechanical. You need spontaneity to feel alive. But if you have no structure at all, you can become lost. You need individuality. But if you become obsessed with your ego, you become isolated. You need connection. But if you completely lose your individuality, you lose your ability to act as an independent person. The tension between these forces is part of being human. And Nietzsche sees Greek tragedy as one of the cultural forms that successfully holds them together. Why Greek tragedy was so important to Nietzsche. Nietzsche believes Greek tragedy achieved something that later culture lost. It combined the individual and the collective, the image and the music, the beautiful and the terrible, the rational and the instinctive, the individual hero and the larger forces of existence, the visible story and the deeper experience underneath it. That combination allowed the Greeks to confront suffering without reducing it to a simple moral lesson. A tragedy doesn't necessarily tell you, good people win and bad people lose. Real life doesn't always work that way. Instead, tragedy can show you that suffering doesn't always have a simple explanation. And Nietzsche believes the Greeks were strong enough to confront that. They didn't need the universe to guarantee a happy ending. They created art that allowed them to face a difficult world. That is what Nietzsche admires. The decline of tragedy. Nietzsche believes that Greek tragedy eventually declined, and he connects this decline with a change in the way people understood existence. The Dionysian element became weaker. Rational explanation became more dominant. The balance between Apollo and Dionysus changed, and Nietzsche associates this transformation especially with Euripides and Socrates. This is one of the controversial historical arguments in the book. Nietzsche believes Euripides represents a more rationalized form of drama. Characters become more psychologically explicit. Arguments become more important. The audience is encouraged to understand what is happening through rational explanation. And behind Euripides, Nietzsche sees Socrates. Socrates represents the belief that reason can expose errors and lead human beings toward knowledge. Nietzsche thinks this intellectual attitude eventually undermines the tragic worldview. Why? Because tragedy depends partly on accepting that existence contains things that cannot be completely resolved. The Socratic attitude wants to investigate, explain, define, correct, improve, solve. Nietzsche believes this eventually produces a culture that becomes increasingly uncomfortable with mystery, contradiction, and suffering. Why Nietzsche thinks knowledge can become a problem. You might think, how could knowledge possibly be bad? Nietzsche isn't arguing that knowledge itself is bad. The problem is the belief that knowledge can provide a complete solution to existence. Suppose you believe that every problem has a rational solution. Then, when you encounter suffering that cannot be solved, you may conclude that something has gone wrong. Maybe you need more information. Maybe you need a better theory. Maybe you need better technology. Maybe you need a better political system. Sometimes those things really do help. But Nietzsche thinks there are limits. You can make medicine better. You can reduce suffering. You can improve society. You can increase knowledge. But you cannot eliminate mortality. You cannot eliminate uncertainty. You cannot guarantee that life will be fair. You cannot remove every painful experience. And if your philosophy depends on eliminating those things, your philosophy is eventually going to collide with reality. Tragedy prepares you for that collision. The scientific mind and the tragic mind. This doesn't mean Nietzsche wants you to reject science. That would be an inaccurate reading. His concern is about scientism, or the belief that scientific rational explanation can become a complete substitute for philosophy, art, myth, and meaning. Science can explain how things happen. It can investigate causes. It can predict events. It can transform your understanding of nature. But science alone doesn't automatically tell you. Why should you value life? What should you love? What makes suffering meaningful? What kind of person should you become? Why should truth matter? Why should beauty matter? Those are philosophical and existential questions. Nietzsche thinks a culture needs more than factual knowledge. It needs a way of relating to existence. And tragedy offers one such way. Truth can be difficult to live with. Another important idea appears here. You might think that the truth is always psychologically beneficial. Nietzsche isn't convinced. What if you discovered every uncomfortable fact about existence? What if you knew exactly how temporary everything was? What if you understood how much suffering exists? What if you knew how little control you actually have? Would more knowledge automatically make you happier? Not necessarily. Nietzsche therefore asks a provocative question. How much truth can a human being tolerate? This question becomes increasingly important throughout his later philosophy. Sometimes illusions are psychologically useful. But Nietzsche does not simply say, "Therefore, believe whatever makes you happy." Instead, he asks whether you can create something stronger than comforting illusion. Can you face difficult truths and still affirm life? That is much harder. And tragedy is one of the cultural mechanisms that can help you do it. The illusion of the Apollonian world. The Apollonian world gives you beautiful forms, but those forms can also hide the underlying chaos. You create a stable identity. You create a beautiful story about your life. You create moral categories. You create social institutions. You create explanations. All of these can be useful. But Nietzsche wants you to remember that they are forms imposed on a deeper reality. If you mistake your interpretation for reality itself, you become fragile. Because eventually, something will happen that doesn't fit your categories. You will meet someone who doesn't behave according to your expectations. You will experience an event you can't explain. You will discover that your identity has changed. You will fail. You will lose something. You will confront death. The Dionysian reminds you that underneath the clean surface, existence is still changing. And this isn't necessarily something you should fear. It is also where creativity comes from. Destruction is part of creation. Think about creativity. Before something new can exist, something often has to change. An old belief has to be abandoned. An old identity has to disappear. An old structure has to be broken. An artist may destroy an earlier version of a work. A person may abandon an old way of living. A culture may replace an old tradition. A forest grows through cycles of destruction and renewal. Dionysus represents this kind of process. Creation and destruction are not always opposites. Sometimes they are connected. You cannot become a new version of yourself without leaving some previous version behind. This is why Nietzsche's philosophy becomes increasingly interested in transformation. He doesn't want you to become a fixed identity. He wants you to become capable of becoming. The self as a process. You usually think, I have a personality. I have certain characteristics. This is who I am. Nietzsche pushes against this static view. You are not a finished object. You are something that is constantly developing. Your values change. Your priorities change. Your relationships change. Your body changes. Your understanding changes. Your ambitions change. Even your interpretation of your own past can change. So perhaps the question isn't, who am I? Perhaps a more Nietzschean question is, what am I becoming? This connects strongly with the tension between Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo gives you a form. Dionysus reminds you that the form is not permanent. You create yourself, but you are also constantly changing. You need enough stability to function, but you also need enough flexibility to transform. Why Nietzsche doesn't want you to escape contradiction. A lot of philosophy tries to resolve contradictions. Nietzsche often wants you to understand them. You want freedom, but you also want security. You want individuality, but you also want belonging. You want truth, but you also want comforting stories. You want order, but you also want spontaneity. You want stability, but you also want growth. You want pleasure, but you also want intensity. You want life, but you know life includes death. These tensions aren't necessarily signs that something has gone wrong. They may be permanent features of human existence. The tragic perspective teaches you to live with them. You don't need to reduce everything to one principle. You don't need to say, only reason matters, or only instinct matters, only order matters, only freedom matters, only pleasure matters. Nietzsche's early philosophy is built around tension, and that tension is productive. Why Nietzsche calls the book The Birth of Tragedy. The title is significant. He isn't merely talking about the historical birth of a theatrical genre. He is interested in the conditions that allow a culture to create tragedy. And tragedy, for Nietzsche, represents a particular relationship with existence. A culture capable of tragedy is capable of confronting suffering without immediately needing to deny it. That is what he admires. He sees tragedy as evidence that the Greeks were not simply optimistic people who admired beauty. They were capable of looking directly at the terrible side of existence and still producing beauty. That combination is what Nietzsche finds remarkable. The question of nihilism. Nietzsche would later become one of the major philosophers associated with nihilism. But The Birth of Tragedy already contains the problem. Nihilism begins when you conclude that existence has no value. If suffering exists, you might conclude, then life is meaningless. If everything dies, you might conclude, then nothing matters. If there is no guaranteed cosmic justice, you might conclude, then morality is pointless. Nietzsche doesn't want that conclusion. He wants to find a way of affirming life without requiring a guarantee that life has some external, eternal justification. That is a major philosophical challenge. Can life be valuable without needing an explanation from outside life? Can you say yes to existence without proving that existence was designed for a purpose? Can you create value rather than waiting for the universe to hand you value? The seeds of these questions are already present in The Birth of Tragedy*. The Greeks didn't need life to be easy. This may be the simplest way to understand Nietzsche's admiration for Greek tragedy. He believes the Greeks developed a culture capable of saying, life is difficult, and then continuing to create. They didn't need suffering to disappear before they could celebrate. They didn't need death to become harmless before they could love life. They didn't need the universe to become completely rational before they could create meaning. They created art in the middle of uncertainty. And Nietzsche thinks that is a sign of cultural strength. A weak culture might need reality to conform to its expectations. A stronger culture might develop the ability to confront reality as it is. That is the standard Nietzsche is beginning to develop. What does it mean to be strong? This gives you another Nietzschean question. What does strength actually mean? You might think strength means avoiding vulnerability, never admitting weakness, never suffering, always winning, always controlling yourself, always being independent. But Nietzsche's tragic philosophy suggests something different. Strength may mean being capable of facing things that you cannot control. You cannot control death. You cannot guarantee success. You cannot eliminate suffering. You cannot make everyone love you. You cannot prevent change. So strength cannot simply mean controlling everything. It can mean developing enough internal capacity to remain affirmative even when control fails. That is a very different definition of strength. And you can see why tragedy becomes a training ground for this kind of strength. It forces you to experience the loss of control without turning away from existence. The importance of ecstasy. The Dionysian is also connected with ecstasy. But here again, don't reduce ecstasy to pleasure. Ecstasy literally involves being outside your ordinary state. You temporarily stop experiencing yourself in the normal way. Music can do this. Art can do this. Collective celebrations can do this. Strong emotions can do this. You become absorbed in something. Your normal self-consciousness becomes weaker. You stop constantly monitoring yourself. You stop thinking, how do I look? What does this mean for my identity? What will people think? You simply experience. Nietzsche sees this as important because modern individual consciousness can become excessively self-focused. You spend so much time thinking about yourself that you forget to experience. Dionysian experience breaks that pattern. The problem of excessive self-consciousness. You know what this feels like. You are at a social event, but instead of enjoying it, you are thinking about how you are behaving. You are speaking to someone, but you're analyzing every sentence. You are doing something creative, but you're constantly judging whether it is good enough. You are experiencing something beautiful, but you're thinking about how you would describe it. You are living your life while simultaneously watching yourself live it. Nietzsche's Dionysian concept offers an escape from that constant self-monitoring. You become immersed. You stop treating yourself as an object that must constantly be evaluated. You become part of the experience. That can be psychologically liberating. But you still need Apollo. If you lived permanently in Dionysian experience, however, you would have a problem. You still need form. You need to return to ordinary life. You need language. You need identity. You need boundaries. You need organization. You need to make decisions. You need to build things. You need to communicate. This is why Nietzsche doesn't simply replace Apollo with Dionysus. He wants their interaction. Dionysus breaks rigid boundaries. Apollo creates new forms. Dionysus destroys. Apollo creates shape. Dionysus reminds you that no form is permanent. Apollo allows you to create. Dionysus prevents you from becoming trapped inside what you created. Together, they produce something richer. The artist as a model of human existence. This is one reason Nietzsche's philosophy is so centered on artistic creation. The artist experiences both forces. You have an idea. You give it form. You work within limitations. You create structure. That's Apollonian. But the creative impulse itself may come from something less conscious, something emotional, something instinctive, something difficult to explain. That's Dionysian. The artist, therefore, becomes a model for the human being. You receive chaotic experience. You transform it into form. You don't simply copy reality. You interpret it. You organize it. You give it meaning. And then the artwork becomes something that other people can experience. This is exactly what tragedy does. It transforms suffering into art. Why Nietzsche thinks art can justify life. This is probably the most important sentence you can take from the book. Art can make life worth affirming, even when life cannot be rationally justified. Notice what this means. Nietzsche isn't saying art proves that life has objective meaning. He's saying something more radical. Maybe life does not come with a simple rational justification. Maybe you cannot prove that existence is ultimately good. But you can still create. You can still experience beauty. You can still participate in culture. You can still dance. You can still make music. You can still love. You can still create something that didn't exist before. You can still affirm existence through your actions. Art becomes a form of affirmation. Instead of asking, "Why should existence exist?" you begin asking, "What can I create with the existence I have?" That is a major shift. The artist does not need to solve life. The artist doesn't need to explain existence. A composer doesn't need to prove that life is meaningful before writing music. A poet doesn't need to solve death before writing a poem. A painter doesn't need to prove that beauty is objective before creating something beautiful. The act of creation itself can become a response to existence. That is why Nietzsche's philosophy is fundamentally creative. He doesn't want you to wait for someone else to give you a final explanation. He wants you to become capable of creating. What Nietzsche means by saying yes to life. You hear Nietzsche talk about affirming life, and it can sound vague. So make it practical. Saying yes to life does not mean pretending everything is good. It doesn't mean forcing yourself to be positive. It doesn't mean denying suffering. It doesn't mean ignoring injustice. It doesn't mean accepting everything passively. It means refusing to make your acceptance of existence conditional on existence becoming exactly what you want. You can say, "This is difficult and I still choose to live. This failed and I will still create something. This relationship ended and I will still value connection. I cannot control everything and I will still act. I will eventually die and I will still take my existence seriously." That is much closer to Nietzsche's tragic affirmation. The difference between acceptance and resignation. But don't confuse affirmation with resignation. Resignation says, "Nothing can be changed, so I give up." Nietzsche is not advocating that. Affirmation says, "Reality is what it is, now what can I create from it?" That's active. You recognize limits, but you still act. You recognize suffering, but you still create. You recognize mortality, but you still live intensely. You recognize uncertainty, but you still make choices. This is why Nietzsche's philosophy eventually becomes associated with self-overcoming. You don't simply accept yourself as a fixed object. You work with what you are and transform it. The birth of tragedy and the question of modern life. Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy in the 19th century, but the questions he raises are not limited to ancient Greece. You live in a world with enormous amounts of information. You can explain more things than previous generations could. You have science, technology, medicine, communication, entertainment, and countless systems designed to make life easier. And yet none of these automatically answers the existential questions. You can know more and still feel lost. You can have more entertainment and still be bored. You can have more comfort and still be dissatisfied. You can have more information and still not know what you value. This is exactly why Nietzsche's criticism of excessive rational optimism remains interesting. Knowledge can tell you more about the world, but knowledge doesn't automatically tell you how to live. Technology can increase your power, but it doesn't automatically tell you what your power should be used for. Science can describe existence, but it doesn't automatically provide a reason for affirming existence. Nietzsche thinks culture needs something more. It needs a relationship with existence. The problem of modern entertainment. You might think modern entertainment is similar to ancient tragedy. Both allow you to escape ordinary life. But Nietzsche would probably distinguish between them. Entertainment can simply distract you. Tragedy confronts you. Entertainment says, forget your problems for a while. Tragedy can say, look directly at the problems of existence and discover that you can survive the encounter. That is a completely different function. Nietzsche wants art to make you stronger, not merely more distracted. The goal isn't to make reality disappear. It is to make you capable of facing reality. Why distraction is not the same as transformation. This distinction matters. If you are suffering and spend a few hours watching something that makes you forget your problems, you may feel better temporarily. But the underlying relationship hasn't necessarily changed. Transformation is different. Transformation means you take the experience and turn it into something. You understand it differently. You create from it. You become different because of it. You don't simply escape the experience. You metabolize it. That is much closer to Nietzsche's artistic model. The relationship between art and life. Nietzsche does not see art as something separate from life. Art is a way of interpreting life, and life itself can become artistic. This idea becomes increasingly important in Nietzsche's later philosophy. You can treat your own existence as something you create. You can shape your character. You can develop your capacities. You can choose what values to cultivate. You can transform your experiences. You can give form to chaos. That is the Apollonian side. But you also need the courage to allow transformation, to let old identities die, to accept uncertainty, to experience intensity, to recognize that you cannot completely control the process. That is the Dionysian side. Nietzsche's real enemy, life denial. At the deepest level, Nietzsche is worried about life denial. Life denial occurs when you decide that actual existence is unacceptable and therefore create a worldview that places the real world beneath some imagined alternative. You might say, the real world is imperfect, but another world will be perfect. Or, my real desires are bad, so I must suppress them completely. Or, human existence is meaningless unless it has some external justification. Or, suffering makes life unacceptable. Nietzsche thinks these responses can become ways of rejecting existence rather than confronting it. He wants you to ask, can you value this world without needing another world to justify it? That question will become central to his later philosophy. The influence of Schopenhauer. To understand Nietzsche's early position, you also need to understand Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer had a major influence on Nietzsche. Schopenhauer saw existence as deeply characterized by suffering. Human beings constantly desire. You want something. You get it. The satisfaction doesn't last. Then you want something else. If you fail, you suffer. If you succeed, the satisfaction eventually disappears. And the cycle continues. Schopenhauer, therefore, developed a deeply pessimistic philosophy. Nietzsche was initially attracted to this. But the birth of tragedy begins moving in another direction. Nietzsche accepts the seriousness of suffering. But instead of concluding, therefore, we should reject existence, he begins asking, can suffering itself become part of an affirmation of existence? That is a major turning point. From Schopenhauerian pessimism to Nietzschean affirmation. You can see Nietzsche gradually moving away from the idea that the best response to suffering is withdrawal from life. He becomes interested in the possibility that suffering can be affirmed. Not because suffering is pleasant, not because suffering is inherently good, but because suffering belongs to the same existence that produces beauty, creativity, love, strength, and art. If you reject existence because it contains suffering, you also reject everything that exists alongside that suffering. Nietzsche wants to break that logic. You cannot simply separate life into, this part is good, this part is bad. I accept the first and reject the second. The tragic worldview says, I accept existence as a whole. That is a much more demanding position. The unity of opposites. This is why opposites are so important. Life is not just pleasure. It is pleasure and pain. Not just creation and destruction. Not just individuality and unity. Not just order and chaos. Not just beauty and terror. The Dionysian represents this underlying unity. You experience yourself as a separate individual, but you are also part of a larger process. You experience beauty, but beauty exists against the background of mortality. You create, but everything you create is temporary. You love, but love creates the possibility of loss. You become an individual, but you remain dependent on others. These aren't bugs in existence. They are part of existence. And tragedy allows you to experience them together. Why the tragic worldview is more immature. Nietzsche's tragic worldview can therefore be understood as a rejection of childish optimism. Childish optimism says, everything will be fine. But childish pessimism says, everything is terrible. Nietzsche wants something more mature. Reality contains both. Some things will be beautiful. Some things will be terrible. Some plans will succeed. Some will fail. You will gain things. You will lose things. You will experience love. You will experience disappointment. You will create. You will eventually disappear. And you don't need to reduce existence to one of these sides. You can affirm the whole. That is the tragic attitude. What tragedy teaches you about control. One of the most practical lessons is about control. You naturally want control. You want to know what will happen. You want your efforts to produce predictable results. You want your relationships to remain stable. You want your health to remain stable. You want your plans to work. But existence does not guarantee any of this. Tragedy teaches you that human beings can act intelligently and still lose. That doesn't make action pointless. It means action and control are different. You can control your response without controlling the outcome. You can create without guaranteeing success. You can love without guaranteeing permanence. You can act without knowing exactly what will happen. This is a much more realistic relationship with existence. Why the tragic hero is still worth admiring. If the hero can lose, why admire the hero? Because courage isn't only about winning. If you knew you could never fail, courage wouldn't mean much. Courage exists partly because the outcome is uncertain. The tragic hero acts despite the possibility of destruction. This doesn't mean you should seek destruction. It means that value cannot be measured only by outcome. Sometimes the way you confront a situation matters, even when you cannot control how it ends. Nietzsche's admiration for tragic figures therefore connects to a broader philosophy of strength. The goal isn't guaranteed victory. The goal is the capacity to act, create, and affirm despite uncertainty. The meaning of self-overcoming. Even though the mature concept of self-overcoming belongs more strongly to Nietzsche's later work. Its foundations are already visible here. You are not supposed to remain exactly as you are. You are supposed to transform. But transformation requires both forces. You need Apollo to give yourself direction. You need Dionysus to prevent that direction from becoming a rigid prison. You create a form. Then you eventually outgrow it. You create a new form. Then you outgrow that too. This is not failure. It is development. Your life becomes a continuous process of creation and destruction. That is much closer to Nietzsche's view of existence than the idea that you should eventually discover one permanent identity and remain inside it forever. Why Nietzsche's philosophy is not simple hedonism. You might hear affirm life and think Nietzsche means enjoy yourself as much as possible. That's not enough. Pleasure is only one part of existence. Nietzsche's affirmation is much larger. It includes difficulty, discipline, creation, risk, loss, growth, failure, intensity, beauty, pain. You don't affirm life only when it feels good. You affirm life as a whole. That is why his philosophy is so demanding. It asks you to stop making comfort the ultimate standard. The difference between comfort and vitality. A comfortable life is not necessarily a strong life. You can be comfortable and bored, safe and empty, entertained and dissatisfied, protected and stagnant. Nietzsche is interested in something more like vitality. A vital person doesn't necessarily avoid difficulty. They have enough energy and creativity to engage with difficulty. This is why he admires cultures capable of creating tragedy. They didn't need existence to be comfortable before they could celebrate it. They could face terrible realities and still produce extraordinary art. That is vitality. Why Nietzsche thinks the Greeks were strong. Nietzsche's admiration for the Greeks, therefore, has little to do with the simple idea that they were civilized or beautiful. He thinks their greatness came partly from their ability to transform suffering into culture. They experienced the terrible side of existence. Instead of collapsing under it, they created. They created myths, music, tragedy, sculpture, poetry, festivals, philosophy. They responded to existence by producing forms of culture that made existence more bearable. For Nietzsche, that is a form of strength. The deeper meaning of Apollo and Dionysus. At this point, you can reduce the two concepts to a useful question. Apollo asks, what form can you give to life? Dionysus asks, can you accept what lies beyond the form? Apollo lets you create. Dionysus prevents you from believing that your creation is the whole truth. Apollo gives you identity. Dionysus reminds you that identity changes. Apollo creates boundaries. Dionysus dissolves them. Apollo makes the world beautiful. Dionysus makes you confront what beauty cannot hide. And tragedy combines them. That is the core of Nietzsche's early philosophy. Why you should not choose between them. If you become purely Apollonian, you may become rigid. You might become obsessed with control. You might think everything must be explained. You might become trapped inside your identity. You might reject anything chaotic. But if you become purely Dionysian, you can lose structure. You may struggle to create anything lasting. You may become overwhelmed by intensity. You may lose the boundaries necessary for ordinary life. Nietzsche's ideal is not one side defeating the other. It is creative tension. You need enough structure to create, and enough openness to transform. Tragedy as a model for living. This gives you a practical interpretation of the entire book. Your life is also a tragedy in the Nietzschean sense. Not because your life is necessarily miserable, but because you know it is temporary. You will lose things. You will change. You will fail. You cannot control everything. And yet you can still create. You can still love. You can still build. You can still experience beauty. You can still become someone. The fact that your life ends does not automatically cancel the value of what happens during it. And that is exactly what Nietzsche finds in Greek tragedy. Why mortality can intensify life. Imagine that everything you did would last forever. Every mistake, every conversation, every moment, every experience. Nothing would disappear. Would that automatically make life better? Maybe not. The temporary nature of experience can make it more intense. A sunset is beautiful partly because it changes. A performance matters partly because it ends. A childhood cannot be repeated. A moment with someone cannot be perfectly recreated. Your life moves forward. You cannot permanently hold everything. Nietzsche's tragic worldview doesn't require you to defeat this fact. It asks you to live intensely within it. The relationship between death and beauty. Death creates a strange relationship with beauty. You know that beautiful things disappear, and yet you value them. You don't say, "This sunset is worthless because it will end." You experience it. You don't say, "This song has no value because it lasts 4 minutes." You listen to it. You don't say, "This friendship is meaningless because people eventually change." You value the friendship. So why should mortality automatically make life meaningless? Nietzsche wants you to question that assumption. Temporary does not mean worthless. Finite does not mean meaningless. Fragile does not mean unimportant. The tragic answer to what is the meaning of life. Nietzsche doesn't give you a simple answer such as, "The meaning of life is X." Instead, the structure of his philosophy suggests that you should stop waiting for an external answer. You have existence. You have your capacities. You have your circumstances. You have your relationships. You have your limitations. What will you do with them? That is the creative question. Meaning becomes something connected to creation rather than discovery. Instead of waiting for the universe to tell you why you exist, you participate in creating value. This is one of the directions Nietzsche's philosophy eventually takes. The birth of tragedy as a rejection of passive existence. A passive philosophy asks, what does life mean? A more active Nietzschean question becomes, what can you make of life? That difference is enormous. The first assumes meaning is something you find. The second suggests meaning can be something you create. The artist is the perfect example. The artist doesn't wait for reality to become beautiful. The artist creates beauty within reality. The tragic artist doesn't wait for suffering to disappear. The artist transforms suffering into art. That is Nietzsche's model. Why creation matters more than explanation. You can explain a painting. You can explain its history. You can analyze its technique. You can describe its colors. But none of those explanations replaces the painting. The same is true of life. You can analyze your existence endlessly. You can ask why you are the way you are. You can study psychology, philosophy, biology, history, but eventually you still have to live. You have to act. You have to choose. You have to create. You have to experience. Nietzsche doesn't want philosophy to become a substitute for living. He wants philosophy to change the way you live. The danger of becoming a spectator. There is another implication here. You can spend your entire life analyzing life without actually living it. You can constantly ask, what does this mean? What should I do? Who am I? What's the correct philosophy? What is the perfect decision? Eventually, analysis itself can become a form of avoidance. Nietzsche's artistic model pushes you toward participation. You don't merely interpret the world. You shape something within it. You become an active creator. That doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means thinking becomes part of living rather than a replacement for it. Why Nietzsche is suspicious of absolute systems. You can now understand another feature of Nietzsche's philosophy. He is suspicious of systems that claim to explain everything. A complete system sounds attractive. You want certainty. You want one theory that explains morality. One theory that explains human nature. One theory that explains suffering. One theory that explains history. But Nietzsche thinks reality is too complex for such systems. A system can become another Apollonian structure that hides the Dionysian complexity underneath. The danger is not structure itself. The danger is forgetting that your structure is an interpretation. You create a map. Then you mistake the map for the territory. The need for intellectual humility. This doesn't mean you should stop believing anything. It means you should recognize the limits of your beliefs. You can have values without pretending that you have solved existence. You can have principles without believing you possess the final answer. You can create meaning without pretending that everyone must accept exactly the same meaning. You can pursue truth while recognizing that your perspective is limited. This kind of intellectual humility is compatible with Nietzsche's philosophy. He is not asking you to become passive. He is asking you to become flexible enough to keep developing. Why Nietzsche's philosophy feels contradictory. You might notice that Nietzsche seems to say contradictory things. He values individuality, but also criticizes excessive individualism. He values form, but also values its destruction. He criticizes rationalism, but doesn't reject thought. He values suffering, but doesn't simply glorify suffering. He criticizes pessimism while acknowledging terrible realities. He values art, but doesn't say art is simply an escape. These tensions are intentional. Nietzsche is trying to prevent you from reducing his philosophy to a simple formula. If you turn Apollo into good and Dionysus into bad, you miss the point. If you turn Dionysus into good and Apollo into bad, you also miss the point. The relationship matters more than either concept alone. The most important lesson. If you remember only one thing from the birth of tragedy *, remember this. Nietzsche is asking whether you can affirm life without first demanding that life become painless, rational, fair, or completely understandable. That is the real challenge. You don't get to choose whether existence contains suffering. You don't get to choose whether you will eventually die. You don't get to control everything that happens. You don't get to make every relationship permanent. You don't get to guarantee that your plans will succeed. You don't get to force reality to conform to your preferred explanation. So what do? You can reject life. You can become cynical. You can distract yourself. You can create comforting explanations. Or you can develop the ability to confront reality and still create. Nietzsche chooses the last option. And Greek tragedy is his example of a culture that did exactly that. What the Greeks can teach you. The Greeks didn't need to believe that life was perfect. They needed to develop ways of living with its imperfection. They created beauty. They created myths. They created music. They created tragedy. And tragedy gave them a way to experience suffering without treating suffering as the final word on existence. That is what Nietzsche finds so powerful. The tragic worldview does not say, life is good because nothing bad happens. It says, life is worth affirming even though terrible things happen. That is a much stronger claim. And this is where Nietzsche becomes Nietzsche. The Birth of Tragedy is an early Nietzsche book. You should not treat it as a complete summary of everything Nietzsche would later believe. His philosophy changes significantly. He later becomes much more critical of some of the ideas expressed here. He develops concepts such as the will to power, eternal recurrence, the Übermensch, genealogy, self-overcoming, and a much more complicated relationship with art, morality, and culture. But the basic concern is already visible. He wants to understand how human beings can live without needing comforting guarantees. He wants to understand how you can face suffering without becoming nihilistic. He wants to understand how values can be created rather than simply inherited. He wants to understand how you can become stronger without denying reality. And he wants to understand what kind of culture produces people capable of doing this. The book is really about you. That's why you shouldn't read The Birth of Tragedy as merely an ancient Greek history lesson. You should use it as a question about yourself. Ask yourself, how much uncertainty can you tolerate? How much suffering can you face without immediately becoming cynical? How dependent are you on having everything explained? How much of your identity is a structure you created to make yourself feel stable? Can you change without feeling that you are losing yourself? Can you accept that some things cannot be controlled? Can you create something even when you know it will eventually disappear? Can you experience beauty without needing to prove that it has eternal value? Can you acknowledge that life contains suffering without concluding that life itself is worthless? And perhaps the biggest question, can you say yes to your existence without requiring existence to first say yes to you? That is the challenge Nietzsche is placing in front of you. The final conflict, do you need life to justify itself? This may be the deepest question in the book. You often assume that life needs to have a reason. Why are you here? What is the purpose? What is the meaning? What makes existence worthwhile? Nietzsche doesn't simply answer those questions. He challenges the assumption behind them. Maybe you don't need existence to justify itself in the way a mathematical proof justifies a conclusion. Maybe the demand for an ultimate justification is itself a symptom of dissatisfaction with existence. Maybe the stronger response is to participate in existence, to create, to experience, to transform, to affirm. The artist doesn't need to prove that art is necessary before creating. The musician doesn't need a cosmic argument before making music. The person who loves someone doesn't need a philosophical proof that love is objectively valuable before experiencing it. Life can be lived before it is completely explained. And perhaps it can never be completely explained. That doesn't prevent you from living it. Apollo gives you a world you can live in. Without Apollo, existence can become overwhelming. You need images. You need language. You need identity. You need boundaries. You need stories. You need structures. You need forms of beauty. You need something that turns chaos into something you can experience. Apollo gives you that. He gives you the world of appearances, the world of individual forms, the world in which you can say, "This is me. This is my life. This is what I am trying to create." That is necessary, but it isn't enough. Dionysus reminds you that the world is bigger. Dionysus breaks open that world. He reminds you, you are not completely separate. Your identity is not permanent. Your control is limited. Your existence is connected to nature. Your individuality is temporary. Your emotions can overwhelm your rational plans. Creation and destruction are connected. Life and death are connected. Beauty and suffering are connected. And this can be frightening, but it can also be liberating. Because if you are not a fixed object, you can change. If your identity is not permanent, you can become something else. If your past doesn't completely determine your future, you can transform. If suffering doesn't automatically invalidate life, you can continue creating. The point is not to choose a side. This is why the final lesson is not become Apollo, and it isn't become Dionysus. It is understand why you need both. You need form and transformation, individuality and connection, order and chaos, reason and instinct, clarity and mystery, creation and destruction. The mistake is assuming that one side can completely replace the other. Human life requires tension, and Nietzsche thinks Greek tragedy was one of the greatest cultural expressions of that tension. What happens when you lose the Dionysian? According to Nietzsche, when the Dionysian disappears, culture becomes increasingly rationalized. Everything needs an explanation. Everything needs a moral lesson. Everything needs to be understandable. Everything needs to be useful. Everything needs to be controlled. The mystery disappears. The instinctive dimension disappears. The collective dimension disappears. The tragic dimension disappears. And eventually, culture may become intellectually sophisticated while becoming existentially weaker. That is Nietzsche's fear. A civilization can know more and still understand less about how to live. What happens when you lose the Apollonian? But the opposite is also a problem. Without Apollo, you lose the forms that make creation possible. You cannot build a stable identity. You cannot organize experience. You cannot communicate clearly. You cannot create durable art. You cannot transform chaos into something shareable. Dionysian intensity without Apollonian form can remain just intensity. Art requires form. Culture requires structure. So Nietzsche's ideal is neither pure reason nor pure instinct. It is their creative interaction. Why tragedy is stronger than optimism. Optimism needs a promise. Tragedy doesn't. Optimism says, everything happens for a reason. Tragedy says, sometimes you will never receive the explanation you want. Optimism says, good will eventually defeat evil. Tragedy says, sometimes good people suffer. Optimism says, everything will work out. Tragedy says, sometimes it won't. And yet tragedy can still affirm life. That is why Nietzsche considers it stronger. It doesn't need reality to become comfortable before saying yes to it. The Nietzschean challenge. So now imagine Nietzsche speaking directly to you. You want certainty, but life doesn't promise certainty. You want permanent happiness, but life doesn't promise permanent happiness. You want control, but life doesn't give you complete control. You want your identity to remain stable, but you are constantly changing. You want your suffering to have a clear explanation, but sometimes it won't. You want everything you love to remain, but everything changes. And Nietzsche asks, what if the answer isn't to demand a different world? What if the answer is to become capable of living in this one? What if you don't need to eliminate the tragic dimension of existence? What if you can create something beautiful inside it? What if your response to uncertainty can be creativity? What if your response to mortality can be intensity? What if your response to suffering can be transformation? What if your response to meaninglessness can be creation? That is where the birth of tragedy asterisk ultimately leads. Life does not have to be perfect to be worth affirming. You don't need to believe that everything is good. You don't need to pretend suffering doesn't matter. You don't need to romanticize tragedy. You don't need to deny injustice. You don't need to become indifferent to pain. You simply need to question one assumption. Does the existence of suffering prove that life is not worth affirming? Nietzsche's answer is no. And Greek tragedy is his evidence. The Greeks knew life was difficult. They knew people died. They knew heroes failed. They knew suffering was unavoidable. And they still created. They still celebrated. They still made art. They still told stories. They still danced. They still made beauty. That is what Nietzsche wants you to notice. The philosophy in one sentence. If you had to reduce the entire philosophical argument of the birth of tragedy asterisk to one sentence, it would be something like this. You become capable of affirming life when you stop demanding that life be free from suffering and learn to transform the tragic parts of existence into creativity, beauty, and strength. And the Greeks show Nietzsche what this looks like through tragedy. Apollo gives suffering a form. Dionysius allows you to confront what exists beyond the form. Tragedy brings them together. And through that combination, suffering no longer has to be the final argument against existence. The final question. So when you finish the birth of tragedy asterisk, don't just ask, what did Nietzsche think about Greek theater? Ask something much more personal. What kind of relationship do you have with existence? Do you need everything to make sense before you can accept it? Do you need life to be comfortable before you can value it? Do you need your future to be guaranteed before you can act? Do you need suffering to have a purpose before you can endure it? Do you need your identity to remain stable before you can change? Do you need the world to justify your existence before you can create meaning? Nietzsche's challenge is to stop waiting for those guarantees. You are already here. The world is already imperfect. Life is already temporary. Uncertainty is already part of it. Suffering is already part of it. And the question is no longer whether you can remove those things. The question is what you can do with the existence you have. You can create. You can transform. You can give form to chaos. You can experience beauty without demanding permanence. You can accept uncertainty without becoming passive. You can recognize suffering without becoming a pessimist. You can understand that you are temporary without deciding that you are therefore meaningless. And you can build a life that does not depend on the fantasy that everything will eventually become exactly the way you want. That is the tragic attitude. Not everything is good. Not everything is terrible. But this is life with everything that comes with it, and I am still willing to say yes. That is the philosophical heart of the birth of tragedy asterisk. And that is why Nietzsche begins with ancient Greek tragedy, but ends up asking a question that has very little to do with ancient Greece. He is asking you whether you are strong enough to face existence without needing to escape it. Whether you can look at suffering without immediately turning against life. Whether you can accept that you are temporary without becoming nihilistic. Whether you can live without complete certainty. Whether you can create without guarantees. Whether you can become something new without knowing exactly what you will become. And whether, after seeing everything that existence contains, you can still choose to participate in it. That is what Nietzsche finds in tragedy. Not an escape from reality. A way of facing reality. Not proof that life is easy. A reason to stop demanding that life be easy. Not an argument that suffering is good. An argument that suffering does not automatically make life bad. Not a promise that everything will make sense. A challenge to live even when it doesn't. And perhaps that is the most important thing you can take from the book. You don't have to make life painless before you can affirm it. You have to become capable of creating value within the life you actually have.